Thank you, Karen, for that very moving devotional. And I think now more than ever is really a time for reflection and spiritual growth. And so, really appreciate you sharing those observations and insights. A great way to start this conversation. And before we jump right in for some questions, I also want to just express my appreciation for the book. It really offers a faith based perspective on immigration, which is, I think, so important when you look at how many faith based organizations are involved with this work, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other religion. We see a common through line, which is that welcoming immigrants and loving them as our own is a moral and spiritual imperative. And you really champion this principle beautifully in your writing. So I think let me just start by asking you, why were you drawn to this book? Did you see a faith-based perspective lacking in conversations about immigrants?
I did. I actually began working for the organization that I work for, doing church mobilization, which meant going to churches and talking to them about this very teaching about God's command that we care for the immigrant in our midst and that we, in fact, do justice for them and love them as our very selves. And first of all, that teaching is sorely lacking in our faith communities. But I began to see that a lot of the resources that were available were not written by immigrants, first of all. They were often written by people who care deeply about immigrants and refugees. And those voices are very important and very needed. And I'm glad that they're in the conversation as well. But I think that there's a place for us who are immigrants, who have the lived experience of being displaced, to also tell our stories. And I wanted to really bring that story in. But as a person of faith, I also wanted to help people to see with God's eyes that there are, in fact, immigrants in the scriptures, both in the Hebrew scriptures and as well as the Christian ones. And, and this was an important message as well, because often people aren't taught to see the Bible this way. The Bible is an unusual book in the sense that people don't read it like they do other books. Other books, we acknowledge that there's different perspectives on them, right? We call this literary criticism. There's a feminist perspective. There's a different kind of Marxist perspective on literature. But people often seem to think that there's only one message conveyed in the Bible, even though it's also a work of literature. And I wanted people to see that no, there's a perspective, an immigrant lens through which you can see the scriptures. And there's a lot of movement of people throughout the entire Bible. And for the same reasons that people migrate today.
And I also understand that this issue is personal to you and your families, as you describe it in the book, Journey to Belong, which, by the way, I think is a really lovely way to frame stories of migration, because clearly it is so much more than just finding a place to live or a job to provide economic self sufficiency. It's obviously also about finding connection and community. So, can you share a little bit more about your own journey to belong?
Sure. So I think it's very complicated. I think one of the things that I have shared with people as I've gone out to speak about this book is that, belonging becomes a sort of double-edged sword. The more that I found belonging, the more that I integrated into life in the United States, the more that I became separated from my own family, because of course, my parents are still deeply Guatemalan. They were in their 30s when they migrated to the US. And for them, the way that they see the world is still firmly from that perspective. Whereas my world I see it through theirs and I see the American as well. And so there's so many ways in which my experience is so different from theirs. But even just language, when you think about something as simple as that, all my parents' education was in Spanish. All my education from the third grade on has been in English. So even that linguistic separation from them, to have a conversation, an intellectual conversation with my father is very difficult for me, right? So belonging in the United States, and that's ultimately the question of immigration, right? Is who belongs, and belonging to a country has been a blessing to me, has been so great in so many ways to belong to two cultures, to find a home in two places. But it also has been costly, as it is for immigrants always. And so for me, it has meant not forgetting my culture, so not assimilating and just forgetting my culture, but trying to maintain both. And that has been a journey that I'm still on, and it's a tension that you have to hold, because it's not an easy thing to do, but it's been a joy for me to experience that.
Yeah. And I can share the sentiment that it is a journey that seems to be never ending. Even with my husband and I, our daughter, my husband's Irish Catholic, immigrant in the sense that, his great great grandparents came to this country, but we also struggle with, what part of your culture, do you share? And I believe that it's always multi-dimensional and generational, and hopefully every immigrant brings with them their heritage and culture. But I do think it is something that we regularly grapple with. Want to also ask you about, you talk about her in your devotional. You also open the book with the story of Ruth and her family, who essentially, as you describe it, right, migrate because of tragedy and a lack of opportunity in their home country. And I thought it was really poignant when you asked the question of what would happen if they tried to travel to the US today. So, what can we learn from her story? And what parallels do you see between her family and those who are coming to the US today?
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a theologian whom I deeply respect, and she wrote something about Ruth, and that Ruth was a refugee. And I wrote to her and I said, I don't know if you know this, but this is the legal definition of a refugee. And because she's not fleeing due to any kind of persecution, she actually, under a modern definition, doesn't qualify as a refugee. However much compassion we might feel for her situation, and she was very surprised by that. And so I let her know, there's only four ways in to this country, and Ruth likely doesn't qualify under any of them. And in today, if she arrived at our southern border, she would be turned away. There's no way that she wouldn't even qualify under something like the diversity visa lottery, because that's for people who had high school education at the very least. So, what I saw in her story was the story of so many immigrants, like my parents, like the friends we had growing up, like so many, the immigrant community that I live in Baltimore. So many people who are simply seeking a better life for themselves, seeking to keep their families together, right? They say those are the top reasons people migrate: for economic opportunities, to keep their families together, to find safety and security. This is a story of Ruth and Naomi. This is what they were looking for as well. And I saw in their story this mirror of so many, my story, but also the story of so many immigrants that I know. And yet the story isn't taught that way typically. It's typically taught as a story about loyalty and a story about a Jesus kind of figure in the Old Testament. And to me, it was tragic that we don't see that, because if we did, we might see how that story can inform our present moment, that it's relevant tremendously.
And there's some other powerful biblical stories of migration you write about in the book. I
Mhm.
think some very persuasive examples of that is your perspective on Jesus as a child refugee, and of course, Joseph in Egypt, and his vulnerability as a foreign person there, and as a victim of crime. What do you think people of faith can learn from those stories?
Yeah. I think the most vitriol I've ever experienced was when I called Jesus a refugee um, in an excerpt that I wrote that was taken from the book. because I think it really bothers people to think about, the very founder of their faith experiencing that kind of vulnerability. But in fact, we see in the story of Jesus, they're fleeing the persecution of a king. And Jesus would have been put to death had his parents not fled with him to Egypt. And we know that the Egyptian Coptic Church even has shrines in Egypt to commemorate where the Holy Family might have stayed when they were there. But what we see in this story is that, you know, Pope Francis did this really beautiful thing. I don't know if you saw it. It was around last Christmas where he put a refugee life jacket on a cross. And I found that so deeply moving because essentially, I think what he was saying is that the way that we treat migrants, the way that we treat refugees arriving at sea, is the very way that we would treat Jesus himself. And so Jesus takes on the identity of a migrant. He says in Matthew 25, a very famous passage, he says, I was an immigrant and you welcome me. So he doesn't say, I was like an immigrant or you should care about immigrants, but he takes on that very identity of vulnerability. And it's a very powerful thing. And I think that really when you consider how many people in mainline, in evangelical, other faith communities are anti-immigration, to me, that is tragic. It's a failure of discipleship, of teaching the truth to people, even when it's hard, because this is in fact something that was incredibly close to the heart of Jesus. It was his own lived experience. And I think that that's something that anyone who reads the story of Jesus in the Gospels can take away. And you see something in both the life of Jesus that you see also in the life of Joseph in Genesis. There's some rhetoric around, that's a false rhetoric around immigration. But what we see is that immigrants are actually more likely to be victims of crimes rather than commit crimes. That has been true in my own family's experience. It's been true in the many immigrants that live in my community. And it's a narrative that is so deeply harmful to immigrants when the opposite of that is promoted, when in fact most immigrants, just because of language barrier, cultural barriers, sometimes status, for a variety of reasons, become vulnerable to people who would prey on them. They're more vulnerable to trafficking, more vulnerable to wage theft, more vulnerable to assault. Anything that you can think of, immigrants are more vulnerable because of chiefly who they are. And this alone should really inspire compassion in us, whether we're people of faith or not, just knowing that this happens to them strictly because they're in vulnerable situations. So, yeah, I think there's so much that we can see in biblical stories about immigrants.
Yeah. And related to that, I actually want to get your thoughts on the book of Romans. So here we see scripture cited by those who tend to oppose immigration, pointing to a scripture that valorizes submission to governing authorities and obeying the law. So I'm sure you saw when former Attorney General Jeff Sessions famously quoted Romans 13 to defend the administration's family separation policy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we also see pro-immigration faith leaders point to parts of Romans that make clear that love is the fulfillment of the law. And so I believe you touch on this in the section about Abraham, but can you share just a little bit more about how you think people of faith can reconcile legality and morality? To what extent do you see a tension there?
Sure. Yeah. And it's probably the most frequent question that I have when I go speak about this is people, most people want to do the right thing. They want to care about others, but some people really get stuck on Romans 13. I want to do the right thing, but what about when people are breaking the law? And so I would point people really to the life of Paul, who wrote that letter. It's the letter of Paul to the Roman church. And in the end, when Paul's life came into opposition with the Roman government and its policies, he chose his faith as the higher law, and he ultimately lost his life. We know he was beheaded by the Roman Empire. And so that's the example of his own life. But we also see, even in our own context, how laws don't necessarily indicate morality. If you think about, it used to be legal to own slaves in our country, to own human beings. It used to be legal that women couldn't vote or own property. It used to be legal to abuse your children and spouse. All of these things used to be legal, but I think we can acknowledge that they weren't moral or good for our society. And I think with immigration, it's the very same thing. I think many of us believe that we're not advocating that people go around breaking the law. We're advocating for immigration policy reform and change because we recognize that the current laws and the current restrictions that exist, executive actions, they harm people in vulnerable situations. They harm people with whom we have a shared humanity. And that really needs to be the highest law for all of us. And this is why we change laws like that. You know, there's a great quote that I found from Martin Luther King's book, Strength to Love, where he says, laws, it's true, can't change people's hearts, but they can restrain those who are heartless, right? And so that's what we want, is we want to create laws that protect people who are in the most vulnerable situations, so that they don't fall prey. So that's really the way that I would respond to that, and just encourage people to consider the laws that exist right now, the number of protests that are happening in our country right now, because there are unjust laws still today.
And I think that in terms of the prejudice and frankly immigrants falling prey to that prejudice, part of that relates to the myths, the fictions, the fear mongering, and what I really appreciated about the book is how effectively it counters myths around immigration and immigrants. So why don't you just ask you, which myths are most important to respond to? What do you think is the best way of addressing the myths without reinforcing them by repeating them?
Sure. Yeah. So I try to repeat facts to people. So if people ask me questions about crime, for example, I will respond with immigrants are good neighbors. Historically, as immigration rates increase, crime decreases. Immigrants are good neighbors. I will say immigrants are the same today as they've always been, because there's also a sort of a myth or perception that today's immigrants are very different from the ones that came in previous centuries. And so I try to encourage people to repeat facts, because it's been shown that if you repeat myths, people will remember the myth, rather than the fact that you're telling them how to refute this false statement. And so that's the way that I try to address it when it comes up. It comes up a lot, that people want me to address this statement or that statement around migration, and that I always respond by telling them these are the facts about migration. Immigrants are good neighbors. Immigrants integrate into our communities. Immigrants are the same as they have always been. We have the same need and the same shared humanity, and try to emphasize that to people so that is what people remember, rather than the many myths that are floating around.
So, on one myth or mythology that you talk about, the good immigrant narrative. So, what we see often are pretty untenable expectations for newcomers, right? Good immigrants work hard and they keep their heads down. Good immigrants don't complain about being marginalized. Good immigrants speak English fluently and they're fully assimilated. And I think that is something that it's really important that you touch on it in the book. So, could you expand for us a little bit about how you think this narrative framing of immigrants either benefits or is a detriment to their own humanity?
Yeah, I really feel that narrative is very harmful to immigrants. It's almost like a rubric of worthiness, that is impossible to attain because, in fact, all of us are just human beings, mostly trying to do the best we can. So to hold someone up to a standard that we ourselves can't even meet seems to me deeply unfair, but also it really diminishes the humanity of immigrants. You're allowed to have a bad day. You're allowed to get a speeding ticket. You're allowed to get angry at a customer service representative and feel bad about it later. You know, you're allowed all of these things because you're a human being. And our humanity is very complicated. But when we hold immigrants up to these standards, not only are they not able to meet them, so then there's never a good enough immigrant person, but we also, I think, take away from who they are as people. We don't allow them the freedom to be. I think it's a deeply harmful narrative as well to immigrants who have a lot of vulnerabilities. You know, I think about a woman that I know in my community who has mental health issues as a result of the trauma she experienced as a refugee, and who has medical needs as well and needs a lot of care. So is she not an immigrant whose life is worthy because she can't work really hard and she can't do all of the things that good immigrants are supposed to do? Or is she still a human being whose life is dignified, whose life is worthy, who's worthy of belonging here with us, and who needs space and time to heal? And so I find that narrative to be just very harmful. And I think because in my own life, I've experienced it as well. I experienced that pressure from my parents who really felt very pressured to be really good immigrants that people could point to and say, see, they're different. You know, they're a good kind of immigrant. But yeah, I tell people that even Jesus himself couldn't meet that standard. You know, Jesus had times when he was tired, when he was angry with people, when he needed time alone. All of these things are part of being human. And we need to allow other people the space to be this way, to acknowledge that they're humans just like us and shouldn't have to be better to belong.
So there are pearls of wisdom like that that could let me spend all day asking you questions on this subject and others. But I don't want to be selfish because I know we already have a number of questions coming in. So I promise the last question I will ask before asking some of the audience Q&A is this one. If there's one thing that our audience should remember from today's session, what would you say that is?
I really think that the most important thing we can do is to remember that we have a shared humanity with immigrants. And when their humanity is disparaged, so is ours. When it's honored, so is ours. And because immigrants are, in fact, exactly like us, right? They don't just bring needs for refuge and economic opportunity, they bring their gifts, their faith, their skills, their talents, their hard work, their family. There's a mutuality of blessing in welcoming immigrants. You know, they're blessed to find refuge, and we're blessed by their God-given gifts and talents. And I think that message is sorely missing. That we need to remember that they are us, we are them. The Mayans used to say, "You are my other self. Eres mi otro yo," right? And it's that same message of we have a shared humanity, and that is our responsibility to people who are immigrants.
That is incredibly beautiful. Thank you for sharing those insights. And I do hope that takeaway is something people will hold with them as they leave this session. All right. So our first set of questions is from one from Raleigh. In the author's opinion, what is the reputation of the Lutherans with regard to immigration?
Yeah. So I actually go to a Lutheran church here in Baltimore, and I'm very familiar with Lutheran social teaching. And actually, there's very strong social teaching around immigration. And I've yet to encounter a Lutheran minister who didn't know that. All Lutheran pastors that I know are very pro immigrant. and very much understand the social teaching of their denomination behind that. I find that to be very similar with other Protestant mainlines, but also with the Catholic Church.
All right. So the next question is from Jimmy. What are your thoughts on using economic arguments supporting acceptance of immigrants? Do you find them more effective? And if so, at what cost? Does this humanize immigrants to some extent?
That is an excellent question. And I will tell you that I have even changed my perspective on this over time because I used to lead with information about the economic benefits of migration. But I found that sometimes, often actually, that ended up really countering my main point that we have a shared humanity with immigrants. I do think it's still good information to share. I think we need to lead with our shared humanity. We can add other things. There's so many good things that come to our countries with migration. But I think it's important to lead with humanity because we don't want to turn people into cogs in a capitalist machine that are just good for us and good for our economy. We want to see them as human beings first. And then I think we can talk about these other things. And so I encourage people, if they care about immigrants, not to lead with economic information, but certainly to add it in. The most important thing, when I encounter people who are very anti immigrant, one of the first things I ask them is, can you and I agree, though, however you feel about refugees, that they are human beings, just like you and me? Let's agree on that first, and then we can talk about other things. So,
Question from Jan. Question from the discussion questions in the book. What are some effective ways to engage children and adolescents in activism around issues they care about? As a deacon, I work with many children and youth and would like some concrete ideas. Also, what are some effective ways to educate adults who do not support open borders or even immigration with justice?
mhm. Yeah. And I think that very much varies. And I think there are multiple tools to use with youth. I used to be a public school teacher. That was actually my first life. And so I found adolescent literature was actually a great way to enter conversations like these. And in particular, I read with some kids recently a book called I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. And it's a book written by a second generation Mexican woman, but it's a book about migration. It's a book about her parents' migration, about growing up between two cultures. And it's such a great entryway into conversations. Narratives speak to our hearts first and then engage our minds. And it's a very powerful way to engage people. And, as far as engaging adults who are very anti immigrant, I don't spend a lot of time doing that. Here's my perspective on this, and of course you can disagree. It's okay to do that. I don't go after sort of the Fox News crowd that's very anti-immigrant. There's 20% of people who are always against a given issue, and there's 20% of people who are already with you. My goal is to engage the 60% people in the middle, and these are people who want to do the best they can, who, if they're people of faith, want to follow their God as faithfully as they can, but don't know what to think. As I told you before, a lot of churches, a lot of faith communities aren't teaching about migration, and that in fact, that these books of faith actually talk about this very important human issue. And so they don't know what to think about it. And so they go with whatever their peers say or their family says. And so when I wrote this book, my intent was for that 60% to read the book and to know, yes, your faith tradition does speak to this. And yes, your God wants you to love and care for and do justice for immigrants. As far as the open borders question, it's not a question I deeply engage in. An ideal world. If we could go back in time, I think it would be a great discussion, but it's really not something that's going to be a reality in any of our lifetimes or maybe ever. And so I don't really engage that question. Usually I talk to people about we can have a border that is secure, but not militarized. We don't need a militarized border because the people coming to our borders are poor people, economic immigrants, refugees. They're not armies that are invading. And so we don't need a militarized border against them. But we do have a border, right? And we can make decisions about the people that come into our country. And we can make decisions to let in a lot more people right now. Mhm.
So I want to ask you a related question about the border. So, a question from Roger. Christian Century recently published an editorial about the politicization of the Border Patrol, citing interference with humanitarian groups assisting those crossing the border into the US. What can you tell us about what is happening in this regard? Um, so I know you may have seen this too, Karen. About a month ago, I was following pretty closely in Arizona. The humanitarian group No More Deaths had a raid on them from DHS. But would love to hear kind of your thoughts and how closely you're following this.
Yeah. One of the things that to me, I don't like to talk about the border as much as I like to talk about the borderlands, because I like to remind people that there's not an imaginary line between Mexico and the US, but there are communities of people who have lived in Mexico and in the US along that imaginary line, right? Um, for centuries, that is their home. And I believe they are really the ones who should be making a lot of decisions about the communities where they live. What I will say is, yes, before this president was elected, a lot of people felt, oh, it doesn't really matter who's president. We have checks and balances and everything is going to be okay. And I think most of us have woken up to the reality that that's in fact not true, that leadership in that White House is deeply, deeply important. And so, yeah, there's been, I have a brother and sister-in-law who work in the State Department, and they've seen the impact working in the State Department on their side, working in the consular side of things. Um, yes, it's the border has become the Border Patrol. It used to just be these little outposts in the middle of nowhere, just making sure drug trafficking wasn't happening. And now it's become this matter of not just hunting down migrants, but hunting down people who provide water for them, just so they don't die in the desert. It's a really terrible thing. So yes, I do believe all of that needs to change, but I think all of that can change when we have someone different in the White House. Sorry, I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
No, I think so. And I think you're right that highlighting how, you've had CBP officers who will just pour out the water jugs that are left simply to allow people to not, die of dehydration. The lack of any empathy or humanity in that, I do think it is troubling. And when you had the raid, I didn't read this particular op-ed, but last month when I was seeing the raids on a group that really was just trying to provide very basic humanitarian assistance, it was deeply troubling. So this is a question that's a little bit more personal to you from Marge. I was troubled by your statement that you and your abuelita, with whom you were very close, had significant cultural differences, which made it impossible to reconcile following the rift about you leaving for college when she wanted you to stay home with your sister. Do you really believe that reconciliation is impossible in such instances?
I don't. I do think it is possible. I think though that what I was really trying to convey, and perhaps imperfectly in that chapter, was the idea that I saw it as a sort of a relational misunderstanding, but it was really a very big cultural misunderstanding because my grandmother lived under very different values. And I think were she still alive today, because she died when I was about 25, were she alive today, I think we could have reconciled and worked through that. But at the time, I don't think I had the understanding or the maturity, perhaps, to really know what was really at work in this rift between us. I didn't see that it was cultural. I just saw it as, why would I stay behind? Nobody does this, in this culture. And so, yes, but I do think it is possible. But I wanted to write the truth. So many of second generation and other first generation immigrants that I know who are my age really struggle with those rifts, and it's deeply difficult. And I've encountered it in every culture. I have good friends that are Korean who experience that with their Korean parents and grandparents, friends who are Indian who experience the same thing, and I've experienced it myself too. And that it is extremely common, even if you consider what's happening in our country right now. A lot of us deeply care about anti-racism work, and a lot of our families just want us to not get involved in that stuff and just, work and be successful and buy a nice house in the suburbs and have a family. They don't want us involved. They're like, we came here so you'd have things that were better, and we don't want you engaged in these things. So even those are still cultural misunderstandings that happen. And because of the backgrounds of everyone involved, it becomes really difficult to navigate. But I don't think it's impossible. And I do think my grandma and I would have reconciled.
That's uplifting to hear.
Yeah.
Question from Trisha. You say that Boaz practiced true hospitality, philoxenia, the love of strangers and foreigners. Could you speak to this today?
Sure. Yeah, just like as you see in the Bible. Well, one of the things that I loved about the story of Ruth is so many times you're reading the Bible, especially the Hebrew scriptures, and you'll encounter people disobeying God's laws and commands and doing terrible things, and then experiencing exile or judgment or something terrible. And this is one of those rare books where people actually did exactly what God said, even though they might have worried about their economy, or the purity of their ethnic group and all of these things that you hear even today. They chose instead to just trust God's command to be hospitable, and it resulted in this beautiful mutuality of blessing. And so what I see today is, I wonder what would have happened. You see in the story of Joseph how much Egypt was blessed to receive this foreigner once they recognized who he had, what he brought, and he chose to stay and live among them, and he brought his whole family there, right? And this entire community was a blessing to Egypt. But then that Pharaoh died. Another Pharaoh came into power who didn't know Joseph, didn't remember Joseph, and that one decides to be deeply suspicious, right? To be deeply worried and fearful about these foreign people in their midst. And we have a moment like that now. We've had all these from the 1980s, where when the refugee program began, we had all these really welcoming policies. We had this reform to our immigration laws to where it wasn't based on race and how white you were, but it was based on family connections and employability. We saw these really good things happening, and now there's this wave against, right, xenophobia rather than philoxenia. But yes, I believe we should return, and we can return to that. But I do believe that it requires what we saw in the book of Ruth. First, it requires trust in the economy of God, that there is enough for all of us. And I realize that's a big ask. That's a big question of faith, right? To really live as if you believe that. And it requires us not living out of fear, not living out of a scarcity kind of mentality, and taking steps toward people who are different from us. I read in the process of researching my book about how we need to practice a discipline of hospitality. I read this really interesting book by a social psychologist called Stranger God, and his whole background is in studying disgust, believe it or not. And basically, what's outside of us seems to always be something we're suspicious of. So whether it's outside of our own body or outside of our own group, our own tribe. But what he talks about in this book as well is this discipline of hospitality, where we enlarge the circle of our affections and bring more people in. I have seen in the work of my organization and work like organizations like LIRS that a lot of times people practice their way into philoxenia. They practice rather than believing their way in, they practice their way in. We have all these churches that volunteer to help resettle refugees or to come alongside immigrants as they're entering this country. And all of a sudden, they're sort of transformed by these relationships. And I do believe that that's possible because I've seen it happen so often. And so, yeah, there's no one simple answer to that. But I do think there is steps that we can take in that direction.
So I am going to combine a couple sets of questions in light of time. So a couple questions from one from Melissa, one from Rick. Ask about, an argument we hear from persons of conservative Christian denominations is, they break the law, they don't follow the law. How can we condone lawbreakers? How do we respond to these folks? And similarly, a question about, this why don't they come here legally? Can you talk about how difficult it is to enter the U.S. legally?
Yeah, sure. And to be fair, a lot of people don't understand how difficult it is. I think a lot of people imagine that there's just a line, and like when you're at Costco or something, you just get in the back and eventually you get to the register. But that's not how immigration works. And for many people, there are no lines to get into. But there are opportunities, which is the very confusing and difficult thing. It's as if our border has two signs, and one of them says, keep out, and the other one says jobs available. And so people know they can come here and get jobs. And so the keep out, I often counter people with the story of Abraham and Sarah. In the story, we meet Abraham as an immigrant. And what does he do? He goes to Egypt and he commits fraud. And then he traffics his wife for his own well-being, and he grows wealthy while she's in the palace. And it's if I just told you those facts, you'd be horrified. You'd be like, no, this guy should never be let into any country. But when we read the story of Abraham, we see that Abraham was fearful, that Abraham was just trying to find sustenance for himself and his family. He wasn't seeking to do any harm to anyone, but he couldn't enter this country in any other way. And so he breaks the law to enter, but he does it only to survive. It's a story of people in a desperate situation who do whatever they have to do to survive. And so often I ask people, what would you do in that situation? What would you do, if something terrible happened and we had to flee to Canada? How would you hope Canadians would receive us? Would you hope they would be suspicious and say, oh no, we have a system and we have points you have to earn, you have to go get in that line? And so one is I do explain to people the realities of the system. So I went through the accreditation to practice immigration law when I was first working in immigration. And so I understand the realities and saw what happens in our legal clinic. But then I also point them to the reality of, really, if you were in desperate need, if your children were in danger, you would flee too, and you wouldn't care about a civic law, right? This civil law, it's not even a criminal law. You would break it to save the lives of your children. You would break it if it meant feeding your family, if it meant the well-being of your spouse or your partner. So, these are very complicated things. Not everyone responds to that. And I want to encourage you that it's good to have these conversations. And I'm so heartened by these questions because we need to be having these conversations with people in our lives. But also, it's not your responsibility to change anyone's mind. You can only have a conversation. You can only engage honestly and share the facts and let people know. And it's really up to them to consider it. And so I don't debate people because honestly, as an immigrant person myself, I don't want to debate my own humanity with people and my own right to belong and exist. So for me, it's deeply personal. But you don't have to do that either if you care deeply about immigrants and want to engage in this level of advocacy. I think you can do the best you can, and then you can leave people, to sit with that conversation, be a safe person who they can come back to and talk about it. So.
Yeah, that's great. And just a final, I know we have a number of other questions that have unfortunately gone unanswered in light of the time, but just related to your last comments, because I think asking a person to put themselves into another's shoes, you're really talking about empathy. And we had a couple questions around this. Well, one was, I'm an immigrant and have struggled to have conversations with my own immigrant family. How would you approach these conversations when immigrants who've been here for a while show resistance to fighting for immigrants right now? And a similar question from David is just, how do you raise the overall empathy factor in our country?
Yeah. So I have experienced this in my own family as well. So I want to encourage you with that. As a matter of fact, I have an uncle and aunt that I had to unfollow on Facebook because of their just violent anti-immigrant comments and sharing of really false statements about migration. I have a lot of compassion for them, believe it or not. I know you're probably not expecting to hear that because there's a lot of self-hatred in an immigrant who hates immigrants. And there's something in them, right, that's not at peace, that's not well, when they can't receive people who are in fact just like them, exactly like them. So I do talk with my family. What I do is, with those relatives, for example, I don't allow them to disparage the image of God and immigrants in front of me. So they're not allowed to say terrible things about immigrants in front of me. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's important to stand up for that, especially in the environment that we're in. But two, I have nieces and nephews that are listening, that are watching. And I think it's important to model that, the things that you believe. I think it's ageist to say that people can't change, that people won't be able to engage these conversations, because they can. People can change at all ages, and they can engage this kind of growth. Will they? Is a separate question, right? So I don't work to change their minds, but I don't. Those are my rules of engagement with them. You can say whatever you want. If you don't like the way our policy is at the border, if you don't like this or that regarding policy, regarding laws, or that's fine. You can say that, but you're not allowed to say awful things about immigrants. And if you do, I'm going to correct you very publicly and very loudly in front of all these children, because that's not okay either. But it is really difficult. And I honestly have a lot of compassion for them, because I don't see how they can live day by day denying this very reality in themselves. So yeah, no simple answer there. Sorry, I don't have a magic answer. And empathy is a really hard thing. It's how do you teach people empathy? I have found, when I wrote this book, I had a pastor in the Midwest write to me and just say, I had never heard, I'd heard a lot of rhetoric around immigration. I had heard Christians tell me that it was the right thing to do, that 83 times in the Bible, in the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, God says to welcome and care for the immigrant. But I had never entered into a story. I had never entered into the experience, in the shoes of either immigrants in the Bible or immigrants that I knew. Most people, they say like 80% of immigrants have never been in an American home for anything other than like a transactional kind of thing. So yeah, there's a deep divide between us because we don't know each other and each other's stories, and I think that's a place to start. And that is one of the reasons I wrote the book as a narrative, is if people never have an immigrant in their home, they're going to be able to enter into my story and understand why my parents migrated, why we were undocumented, how hard it was to be undocumented, and that it wasn't our desire ever to break the law and to not care about that.
That is, I think, one of the many, many contributions that your book makes. Such a rich book, such a rich conversation. I really wish we could talk all afternoon, but I know that we are already over time. So I just want to thank you, Karen Gonzalez, once again for your time and insight today. If you want to share a recording of today's session, learn more about The God Who Sees and where to purchase it, keep an eye out for a follow-up email that we'll send that will include all of that, as well as registration information for our last virtual book event of the summer. I really hope you can join us next week on Tuesday, September 8th at 3 o'clock, so same time, for our final conversation with Jacob Soboroff of NBC News, author of Separated: Inside an American Tragedy, which traces the unfolding of the family separation crisis from 2 summers ago. Jacob has tracked this story closely, and as you might know, LRS was called upon by the government to help reunite these families. So it's a subject that's obviously very close to our hearts, and I imagine many of yours as well. So until then, enjoy your summer reads. Please stay safe and enjoy the long weekend, and see you right after Labor Day. Thanks again.